Welcome back. Well, yes, as you've seen, there are two gentlemen joining us to make sense of the budget and tell us how this will affect you. Yeah, that's what we intend to do today. So we've got Mr. Boniface Chizia, who joins us virtually, and Mr. Paul Alaje joining us from our studios in Lagos. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having us. Yes.
All right, let me start with you, Mr. Alaje. Yes, we heard the budget of economic growth and sustainability. We've seen the assumptions, but to a lot of people, it appears as though it's a yearly ritual, but it's more than that, we reckon. So give us your impression of what you make of these assumptions concerning vis-a-vis the economy. Perhaps we'll start with that and then take it a little step further.
Good morning once again, and thank you for having me. I've looked at the presentation made by Mr. President yesterday. Quite a number of interesting assumptions. First, government is expecting to finance this budget. One of the major window of financing, it remains what will come from crude oil, as we'll be expecting over 3 trillion in revenue expectedly from crude oil. That on one side. We're also looking at exchange rate of about 410 naira to $1, even though what CBN is currently displaying or what is applicable now in e-window, it's a bit above that. On the second side. On the third side, our government is looking at debt service of over 3 trillion. In fact, that is even higher than what we're expecting to generate in revenue from crude oil alone. Government is considering a number of capital expenditure from what Mr. President presented. But by and large, we are seeing a bit less than 30% of capex when compared to the entire budget presentation. So we have a deficit of over 6 trillion, which is a huge, huge concern. Mr. President also said he understands if people are concerned and that they have right to be so. The comment that we made is that it is borrowing that brought us out of recession. And I'm wondering how borrowing has brought Nigeria out of recession. Maybe as the conversation continues, we can look at the implication of borrowing, or maybe it was even the foundation for going into recession in the first instance, based on economic principle and what is applicable this moment today.
All right, so we'll come back and take a look at some of those projections and see what could that have been predicated on. Were they right assumptions or otherwise, Mr. Alaje? But just give us a moment. Mr. Chizia, how do those assumptions match up with your perception about budget reality in the country at the moment?
Well, I think to a large extent, I think the assumptions are not terribly off the mark. If you take the fuel price, that has been pegged at $57 per barrel. As of yesterday, oil sold at above $81 per barrel. Even last month, it was almost 79. So I think that if you look at the oil, yes. If you look at the growth projections, the growth has been projected as 4.something%. Well, that's a bit ambitious when you look at it, because I would expect that probably by the end of this year, we'll probably be growing about 2.something%. But okay, so we'll wait and see what will happen next year. And so if you look at inflation, we said target is 13%. And it's about 17% now. So it's coming down. So again, that is to some extent realistic. So I think that to a large extent, I think they've tried as much as possible, to try and be a bit realistic. But of course, we're talking about targets, we're talking about projections. So the thing is for you, what that does to you is for you to, to have what to set your sights on, and like a beacon, to guide you as you go on the journey. So you're not going to realize those targets and projections the way they've been put there. It would be a wonderful coincidence if we do. But I think that we are in the right direction. But I think the thing we should commend the executive, for presenting the budget when they did. Present the budget at this time of the year.
Okay, Mr. Alaje, so when you did highlight some part of that when the president says, well, this borrowing got us out of recession. So one wonders in what context, because, they usually have said that we have to spend our way out of recession. So could it be that they talk about funds being available via borrowing, which we then spend to bring us out of recession? What context could that have been?
And when you look at the last recession, it was as a result of seizure on both demand side and supply side. So there was market seizure. People could not go out. And when you look at NBS report that said Nigeria had grown by over 5%, one of the things you notice is that the transport sector, particularly road transport, had increased significantly to close to 80 or 90%. When you look at other sectors that were responsible for that huge recovery, it was because of the lockdown policy that was government put in place in order to save lives as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, coming out of the pandemic or the lockdowns as we had them, last year, it is commonsensical and it is normal that you are going to see a jump. The truth is that central bank particularly, and I think Niger Microfinance Bank has tried to support households, support businesses, etc., etc. We cannot say particularly that it was because we borrowed. And you see, when it comes to borrowing, should we even continue to borrow? And I'm seeing over 6 trillion naira that will be borrowing. When you look at oil revenue, we have 3.16 trillion as presented by Mr. President. And when you look at debt service, we have 3.61, excess of about 500 billion that we need to get. If we realize, which is a bit of concern based on Mr. President's presentation, we had reduction in revenue in 2021 projection because of shortfall. And when you look at what was presented in MTEP that was based on pro rata, to me, we have not been able to achieve revenue target, particularly when we depend so much on crude oil, which seems to have concern. So when we say that borrowing is what brought us out of recession, there may be other things that maybe President or the team has not mentioned to us, but to say that we came out of recession will not be that. But when you look at the implication and impact of debt, which is the third and the final analysis, when it comes to should a country continue to borrow, there are 3 explanations, 2 traditional and 1 a more recent time as economists has put in place. What is the relationship between debt to GDP on one hand? When you look at our debt to GDP, we are doing below 40%. Countries are doing 50% and so on and so forth. One, we assume that Nigeria can keep borrowing, but that is just a necessary condition. There is another condition called sufficient condition. By the way, if you satisfy necessary condition but not sufficient condition, it means you should not accept to take such decision. Now, when it comes to the second decision, which is what is happening to debt service to revenue, you should not do more than 1/3 of your revenue. And there are reports here and there, we did over 60%, we did over 90%, which means borrowing is no longer an option. Now, where is the impact? The last and the most recent evidence by economists reveal that the impact of debt is more important than the first 2 analyses. For Nigeria, debt has increased by over 20% on average in the last 5 years. But when you look at GDP growth, it's less than 2%. Meanwhile, you should not have less than half of increase in debt. So the numbers don't agree with it. Economics don't agree with it. And even explanations. It's very tough to explain that while we're having less than 10% of the rate of borrowing on the impact of GDP, how did that borrowing then brought our economy out of recession? For me, I think because people were released, the lockdown were no longer there, and which is the evidence released by the National Bureau of Statistics, and evidence that we can lay our hands on and review that more and more people are getting back to their farms, more and more people are getting back to their businesses. Private sector have been unleashed, they can go back to their businesses. That is a better explanation to say why we are out of the recession and why we have the growth. And by the way, the growth rate was based on a negative growth rate, which was -6%. So it now agrees with reason that if you have -6% and you release your people to do businesses, exchange, the demand side is released, supply side is released, you are going to see such growth. So that is explainable now and it's more understandable than what we had before.
Those who would still say, perhaps economists like yourself, Mr. Alaje, would say that, well, we are just technically out of recession. How significant, you know, that will be in the scheme of things, you guys will tell us later. But let me switch to Mr. Chizia. Well, Mr. Laje had mentioned a number of things concerning revenue and all of that. But if you look at the budget that the president presented, one of the two things he mentioned that's a little concerning for me, actual revenues were 34% below target as of mid this year. And he also said that the federal government's share of oil revenue was 51% below target. And non-oil revenues were also poor, according to him. Now, all of this is from the 2021 budget analysis from the president's perspective himself. And there are still some assumptions for the 2022 budget. How optimistic are you, given these figures that the president quoted himself based on his assumptions in the budget he presented last year, that this year's budget, or rather the next year's budget, will do any better?
Well, okay, let me first of all make some comments about getting out of recession. I think that we should put things in context. You wouldn't get out of recession if you didn't have activities. So you needed to get back production activities going on in the economy. And given the state of the economy, as at that point in time, when we had a recession, we had pandemic, then you needed to spend some money. You needed to pump some money into the system for you to get out of recession. There's no two way about it. There's no know how you get out of recession. If you are stagnant and you don't spend money and there was no production, no activities in the economy, then nothing's going to happen. So, okay, let me take that. But I think that issues about projections and so on and so forth, which the presidency has put in the budget, I think that's it's very easy for us. You know, talk is cheap. You know, so we commentators, analysts, and so on, we sit at the back and then we just make comments, and we have to take those comments, you know, as they come, because the budget office of the federation, they have all the facts and they don't know the analysis. And they have no cost.
Mr. Chizia, just 1 second. On that same issue that you have raised of us spending ourselves out of this recession, there is a big argument around the fact that we need to be a producing economy to be able to do better economically as a country. But right now, and a number of people would point out, so economists as yourself inclusive, would say, wait a minute, we are not a producing country. Consequently, the Naira cannot do any better. Consequently, the economy cannot do any better unless we are spending to produce. So would you say that we are spending to produce?
Well, that should be the target. If you are spending on infrastructure and so on and so forth, you'd expect that eventually to have knock-on effect, you know, on your productivity. I mean, the issue of the productive base of this country it's been a work in progress since 1986 when we introduced the Social Adjustment Program. We tried to diversify the revenue base of this country away from oil, and then we'll not be able to make. There's been no magic. And so when people look at the rate of exchange and they go on saying lots of things that they've been saying, you know, so you expect to make omelets without breaking eggs. You cannot have productivity. It's not a tap. You don't just turn it on and water begins to flow. It's something that it takes some time. It must have some focus.
But Mr. Chizia, we have had quite some time. A number of people would argue that it's 21 years into the Fourth Republic, and it would seem like, okay, at some point in the same Fourth Republic, we exited, owing any country, and then along the line, we just seem to be going right into it again. So in terms of borrowing to produce or creating the enabling environment for government to strengthen the private sector and micro and small businesses to produce, how significantly would you say we have done? Let's just say over the past 5 years.
Yeah, we've not done too well. I think the verdict is certain on that. Not done too well. I think that there are also reasons why.
So then how much time do we need to do better?
Well, it's up to us. We have to get our acts together. You know, we start from our politics. You know, get our politics together.
What's the missing link? You've talked about our politics. That would differ from our policies, wouldn't it?
Yes. Well, to some extent, you know, politics comes first. There are two sides of a coin. You know, so you have politics and economy. I mean, take the governor of Central Bank. There's a limit to what he could do. You know, given our environment, given the way he came on board.
Okay. All right. Let me ask. You've not answered my question, Mr. Chizia, but let me bring that same issue to Mr. Alaje. What's your take on all of that, all of the comments concerning our capacity to produce and all of that?
Well, there is a popular African adage that says, if you spend 20 years to rehearse madness, exactly when are you going to practice it? Our economy perpetually has remained primary, whether you call it oil or agriculture. Before oil was discovered, the authorities then say we need to diversify away from agriculture. Several economic tests can attest to that, to the claim. Apart from that, when we discover oil, after some time, we said we need to diversify away from oil into what? Back to agriculture. The truth is that agriculture is primary in the level of production, and oil is also primary in the level of production. And if you look at what National Bureau of Statistics reported in Q4 report of 2020, trade report by National Bureau of Statistics, over 90% of our export was on oil. So it's an economy that is not producing. Oil itself is primary. Why is it primary? Because nature to a large extent is involved. The same with agriculture. And what did we export after that? We exported seeds, which is also agri output. And when you look at hierarchy of things, it means that we are not contributing to nature. That is 210 million people. Our industry are not effective. And by the way, man is meeting. I really don't know why it's challenging for more than 21 years in recent time, and 1960 till date, we still find it very challenging to transform our economy from primary to secondary and to tertiary. And if you wait with the comparison, the largest country in Asia is China. China has huge population, just as Nigeria has huge population compared to the rest of Africa. But China is no longer dependent on primary, whether it's a natural resource or agriculture. You may want to go a bit into the Americans and consider the North America. United States is the largest, among the countries in North America. United States does not rely solely on primary, whether it's a natural resource or agriculture.
But Mr.
Then fast forward again.
Just a second. Let's stick to the issue of this budget thing. Do you see the budget right now encouraging the OPS to produce?
Well, if you ask me if I see the budget encouraging, I would say that quite a number of things. This budget is not sectorial in nature. This budget will help us to sustain our civil service. It will also help us to combat insurgency, quite a number of good things. But a budget that will deliver us from economic penury and economic concern, it will be sector targets. And one of the sectors that will take lead will be capital expenditure on power generation. Apart from power, education, etc., etc. Just like last year's budget, this budget is more than ×2. What we spend on service is more than ×2 of the total allocation to education and health together. That is, when you combine all going to health and combine all going to education, ×2 of those and more is what we'll be spending to service. So how will it encourage when most of the projected revenue or most of the projected borrowings is going to be we are going to be spending on service of debt? And it's more dangerous even when these borrowings will be coming from outside Nigeria, knowing fully well that recent loans that we are getting are now coming from commercial loans, talking about bonds, euro bonds, etc., etc. So do I think it will? Yes, it will, but to what extent will be a big concern and challenge?
And I think this has brought up that classic conversation. I mean, when you talk about paying salaries, which is a given, you hear government ask you, do you expect us to retrench people? We have these people on civil service on our payroll. About 4 trillion naira, thereabout, of the budget is going, or the appropriation bill is going to that one. 6 trillion is going to the recurrent angle. You've referenced this against capital expenditure. And that classic question of, so what is the alternative really? If you say that we need to have more capital expenditure as opposed to recurrent expenditure or just paying salaries, what is the alternative? Do you expect us to cut that, the recurrent, provisions, which means we're going to cut jobs? So in terms of realistically speaking now, is there an alternative really?
Well, a lot of alternatives we have that government has, and some of them are in this document. Some of them are things that are not contained in this document that the president submitted yesterday. $57 to a dollar per barrel. I think that should be jacked up to about $60. That will help government save over 44 billion naira without doing anything, just looking at the document. If government could make that adjustment, that's on one hand. On the other hand, government needs to reconsider what we call revenue to the GDP, tax revenue to the GDP. Nigeria is perhaps one of the least, if not the least, in the entire Africa. And when you look at countries that have borrowed so much and we look at their debt to GDP, what we are also not comparing is their revenue, tax component to their GDP. So if you want to borrow like them and we don't want to earn like them, then someday we might have a lot of concern to deal with. So what are the other alternatives? When you look at capital expenditure, we do not need to necessarily prepare this budget and put a lot of money that government must spend on capital expenditure. It is obvious that federal government or state government alone will not be able to finance capital expenditure. Then we can now come together, look for more private sector investors, and they don't have to be the super rich. A good example of what has happened in Lagos is Oshodi-Apapa Expressway, where one of the richest African, particularly the one that have constructed that road. How do we have more and more of these people join government to put effort in place and perhaps to solve some of the challenges?
Interestingly,
We
you
also
just
have
said, pardon me if I could just jump in, you just said they don't have to be super rich, but the example you gave is the example of super rich person getting involved. And interestingly or incidentally, the head of the budget office of the Federation was on our sister program, Politics Day, yesterday, where he was talking about this PPP arrangement, saying, well, he's been in the private sector, he's been in government, and from his experience, things like that rarely work. That even getting the fine details, the negotiations alone, can take a long time. So for him, he just thinks that the government has decided to go this way because this is what will work, especially in the context of the challenge we have. So how possible is it really realistically, again, to have this PPP arrangement when, we can only count a few of those super rich individuals that we have?
Now, most of the projects that Nigeria have tried to adopt this PPP on are projects that cannot generate revenue. So if there are no revenues or there are no direct impact on private sector, it will be tough for them to get involved. You have seen what we want to do with roads now by towing it and asking people to invest, and government will have some percentage of the investment. That will work because private sector is not just looking at putting their fund and hoping that that will be taken for tax credit. They are looking at benefit of today, that we can have, and setting up a body or an institution to manage what comes into road construction and other capital expenditure that government should have naturally spent in form of budget will help us conserve monies that are not even available in the first instance, or money that we would have spent on, say, recurrent expenditure or capital expenditure, wanting to expand our budget. Again, when you look at what National Bureau of Statistics has reported in terms of organization or sectors, and which is why I think budget should have been in sectors and target to grow some sectors year in, year out, maybe 4 or 5 years. When you look at the report shared by National Bureau of Statistics, it reveals that operators within ICT and so on and so forth have continued to grow with or without recession. What seems to be missing is when we now compare that with the revenue government is generating from this sector, it is not growing the way it is expected. So maybe government just need to reconsider to say, if this sector is growing, why is revenue component or revenue coming from government with the sector that have been growing according to National Bureau of Statistics not growing exactly?
All right, we'll come back to this conversation when we return from this break. Join us again. Welcome back, Mr. Chizia. So, what budget revenue or revenue alternatives can we leverage on? Well, if you call them low-hanging fruits, fine. But lots of people have raised concerns as to where we can, how to fund the budget, which is always a challenge. So what do you see? How can we take advantage of it?
Okay, Chamberlain, I need to make some little corrections, from what I've heard so far. I think we cannot diversify from agriculture. Agriculture is the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. What we try to do with agriculture is to get value addition. So, like my colleague just observed, we don't want to remain at the end of exporting primary products. We want to add value. But agriculture remains the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. It contributes 20% to our GDP. In terms of employment, massive employment goes into agriculture. Now, second point I also want to make comment on this. You cannot have public-private sector partnership without that project bringing in revenue.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chizia. Could you just shed a little more light? When you say agric is the mainstay of our economy, are people talking about it in terms of the revenue we get from that? Or how do you mean?
No, we're talking in terms of GDP, productivity in the economy. We're talking in terms of employment, the percentage of people employed in this country. In fact, if you look at this administration, you look at the presidency, even the budget itself, we are still talking about intensifying efforts in the area of agriculture. So we cannot be saying that we diversify from agriculture. No, we want to have value addition. So instead of exporting primary products, we want to process them, add some value, create more employment opportunities before we export. Because I don't wish to say this because many people are listening to us, and we don't want to make sure we lead them with the wrong impression. Now, if you talk about where we're going to get revenue, it's very easy. The shortest cut is to remove the oil subsidy. Now, the oil subsidy we're talking of oil subsidies of the order of probably 900 billion a year. The budget for education is 400 billion. Budget for health is 400 billion. In spite of the fact that UNESCO, they've said we should do 16% on education when we are doing 4%. And if you go to health, we're doing 15%. We're doing much less than that. But so if you want where you get revenue, quick revenue, find a political will to remove the subsidy today. And that's the fastest. Yes.
I'm just trying to get. Yeah. Well, did you say diversify from agriculture or to agriculture?
No, agriculture. Agriculture is there. It remains the mainstay. We can't diversify from agriculture. Agriculture is there. We intensify effort in agriculture. In fact, when you have food security, and then once you remove hunger from any problems, then you almost the seriousness of that problem is mitigated. So you remove. What we are trying to do is to say to get the impact of agriculture on the economy to increase its impact. So instead of exporting mangoes and oranges and so on, you produce a juice, you can it, and you export. That's what I'm saying. And I also emphasize that agriculture remains the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. There's no two about it. If you in terms of GDP, in terms of people that are employed in agriculture, you go to the informal sector, go to rural areas, it's all agriculture. I mean, now today, in terms of what sector to go to again, will be.
Mr. Chizia, I think that the part of the conversation, I mean, from what I've heard so far, is the fact that yes, we are huge on agriculture in terms of potential, but when it comes to what we derive from agriculture, when you compare that to oil revenues, it's still a far cry. So I think that conversation is largely centered around ensuring that agriculture, being the mainstay, as you call it, is indeed the mainstay in terms of generating revenue. And you've referenced value addition, which I think is a general consensus on how to build agriculture in such a way that we can get it to do very well, perhaps better than our oil revenues. But in terms of looking at what we have right now, in the context of this budget, in context of where we are, I imagine that getting agriculture to do well might be a midterm issue. But where we are right now, in terms of raising more revenues, I know you talked about the PPP arrangement. You referenced it as well. Perhaps you want to finish on that one because Mr. Laji thinks it's the way to go. You started off on it. If you could just finish up on that one.
Yes, I think that when you are constrained, and I think to a large extent, Nigeria remains attractive, so that's why we have been able to get all these loans and so on and so forth. All you need to do is to improve on your investment environment, improve on it, bring more sanctity that we've just done with the oil sector, so you have Petroleum Industry Act, has just been implemented. Once you do that and people begin to come in, then you have to do that because we have constraints and we have to come to terms to the reality that we have these constraints. And so, like as you just observed, PPP certainly is a way to go. And remember, we have an agency that is specially dedicated, to make sure that, we gain some traction in that direction. We have infrastructural, constitutional, agency that's supposed to be doing that. So it's not something that government does not do. But we need to intensify efforts on that.
So another part of this conversation which has come up time and again, and the president has had to respond to it, is the borrowing aspect. And I'm not sure how much of it you have touched on personally. So there's the conversation of whether or not it is healthy. Some even say we are even borrowing to repay what we have borrowed to service our debts, because when you look at the revenue we get in terms of with oil and the dwindling, oil revenues we got last year, some say we have to borrow again just to service our previous debt. So, working our way around this and saying that we need more revenue. So, are we going to get to tax more? I don't know what your view is on that in the light of where we are right now as a nation. What is this whole conversation around debt? What does it mean to you?
Well, let me tell you. I think most of us economists, we put our heads in the cloud. I'm telling you. This country has no alternative but to borrow today. Let somebody tell me what you're going to do. I mean, people want proposals and so on and so forth. Those are long term. You have a crisis, your house on fire, the roof on your house on fire. And you're talking about, you're dancing around and you're playing games. We have to borrow. There's no two-way about it. But what we need to do is to make sure that it has to be targeted borrowing. We need to plug the leakages. Now, most of the problems we have in this economy is that lots of leakages. Even when
so which one comes first? Well, borrowing before plugging leakages, or plug leakages, borrow? How do you reconcile that?
I don't know whether I need to sequence them, but I think that we have to be up and doing. We need to, I think that the leakages are terrible. I think we need to do something like leakages. If you ask me, yes, if you have holes in your bag, and you're putting water into that bag, I mean, you know which one to tackle first. But it's not just like that. So when you look at it, it's not like that. It's not sort of where you want which one should come first. This country has to run. So when people say we're borrowing, we mustn't borrow, so what then do we do? Now, there are lots of countries, if we don't borrow, the crisis we have today on our hands, will be a child's play.
I'm going to throw that question to Ms. Alaje, because you say economists, most of our economists will have our heads in the cloud, will have to borrow. That's the only option. Ms. Alaje, what say you?
Yeah.
Well, if we check what Debt Management Office reported in February, Nigeria devalued from about 390 to 410. Because of that devaluation, we added 1 trillion naira to our debt profile. Who is going to pay back the money? It is easy. The easiest way and the lazy way out of an economic imbalance is to quickly go and borrow. What have you done? You have postponed the evil day to a future date. I also need to correct something. When we say agriculture is the mainstay of our economy, and therefore we should not be talking about the diversification, rather we should be talking about deepening. I think what the economy actually said otherwise. For a country with huge population, such as we have, and I was making comparison, I was going to land on a thought. When you consider Germany, you don't hear about German farm, you hear about German machine. Because this country have huge population, and they are in fact the largest in their continent. Nigeria must diversify. I am not particular about agriculture or about oil, but we must diversify, whether it is agriculture or in oil, into production. And this is where states can even become more sustainable, because they will earn personal income tax. Federal government we heard from company income tax. There will be more for people to consume, and we're going to get more from VAT. But when we say that, don't worry, let's continue to patch it as we go. Let's continue to borrow, because that is the only way we have right now.
How is that different? I'm sorry, how is that different, the talk about production? How is it different from value addition? Because isn't that the same, philosophy of value addition? Take this raw material, get it into production, add value to it. Is that one and the same thing for you, or different?
Well, it depends on how you call it and how deeply you want to explain value addition. because mere buying raw meat and I roast it and I sell it as suya have also added value. It depends on. But when you are talking of value addition, that has to generate huge number of jobs. And when jobs are created, you are going to be having taxes going to state government. You are going to be having revenue going to federal government. People are consuming. You are having VAT. That is when the tax component of the GDP will increase significantly. And watch it. For all of us in the studio and the other guests that is joining virtually today, if I ask, for the four of you, where would you love to spend your holidays? And why is it that of the $30 billion, about $300 billion that is going to come on tourism in the next 4 to 5 years, why are we going to participate less in terms of revenue? What happens to our tourist centers? Why are they not being patronized the way Nigerians want to patronize the one outside? Because the environment for development, this is so very important. We are talking about growth and sustainability, but what guarantees sustainability is the environment for development. When you read National Bureau of Statistics report, it shows that rather than attracting more investment, we might not be attracting investment as much as we do because of exchange rate environment. We are not actually sure whether it is 400 or 500 as it is being reported from some headquarters. That on one side. We are not also sure what the output in types of electricity will be today. So quite a number of concerns that we need to tackle headlong, and this will not come by mere borrowing. If you want to borrow and say we want to develop the entire Nigeria within 5 or 10 years, and let's just borrow all the money and we'll generate the revenue, but that may make sense. But we are saying we are borrowing, and the impact, you may want to read the National Bureau of Statistics report and have some and deduce all of these facts that have been mentioned. If we are borrowed on the average of over 20%, according to several reports put together by the Debt Management Office, and the growth shared by National Bureau of Statistics showing that it's average of 2%, then should we continue to borrow? I'm very concerned if you say continue, borrowing should continue is the way to go.
So, Mr. Chizia, our concluding moments now. In addition to your response to what Mr. Alaje has said with that last question, add to that, if they keep saying we're within the threshold, oh, 23, it's still okay, it's not up to 40. So when we do get to 40, what then happens if we exceed that threshold? So respond to that in conclusion to your statement. Yeah.
Well, if you listen to the president during his presentation, he did say that what is revenue problem is not debt problem. I think that I go with that. I agree that debt is mounting. You know what? Why I say we put our heads in the clouds is that we have a budget to prepare today, and you have to do the budget. Now remove the money we projected to borrow, which is 5 trillion naira. Remove it today from the budget and tell me how you run this country. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we should continue to do that, but I'm saying that as it is today, we have no choice. And the president is also right in saying that the problem we have to a large extent is that we don't have revenue. We're not generating revenue. You know, our tax to GDP base, like as mentioned, is 9%. In fact, we're projecting to grow to 15%. And he did say, the president in his presentation did say that if we get to 15%, now this cry about revenue to debt servicing will begin to, get ameliorated. So I think that is a challenge. We make comments and we don't put ourselves in that. We put ourselves in a situation. I said today, I'm preparing this budget, and this is the situation today. And you're telling me to do this and do that. I just said to it, for instance, remove subsidy, petroleum prices, and put up this. Announced in March they are going to remove subsidy from petroleum. Have they been able to do that? And so now we said so. I just said so when he asked me what's the fastest way, what's the low-hanging fruit. I said, yes, remove subsidy. But I know it's going to take some time. I know that it's not going to be easy. When you do that, the unions will be up in arms. And you have crisis on your hands. We have Jonathan experience, 2012. This country was almost brought to a halt. So, yes, it says that we have to put processes in place, and they're sequential. You have increases in tariff of electricity. We had a program for this increment, and we did not do that. And now suddenly we're trying to increase. Where I live, I've suffered 100% increase in tariff overnight. And so, not many people can take that. So,
all right,
because we failed.
Mr. Chizie, well, yeah, about that subsidy. Well, after all the hue and cry about the subsidy, look at where we are today. So they made a point, say, well, look, if we go further in this, we'll just keep going on and on. Well, I have to thank both of you for coming on this morning, Mr. Boniface Chizie and Mr. Paul Olaji, both of them economists. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
All right, we will be back in a moment. We'll talk about, well, just hang on there. We're back in a moment.
That's what we're focusing on at this moment. The amendment of the Victims of Gunshot Act 2017. I mean, you've seen pictures of two young men that passed on as a result of issues surrounding that. But, I mean, there are two of a lot of others, and this has been something we have talked about time and again. There's also the National Health Act that is also being looked into, talking about funding. And this morning we are being joined on the program by two gentlemen. Professor Innocent Ujai is the president of the Nigerian Medical Association. He joins us via Zoom. We're also being joined by Mr. Femi Aborishade, founding member NCP, who's also a human rights lawyer. He joins us via Zoom as well from Ibadan. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the program. I'd like to begin with Professor Uja. We'll get into this amendment, this process, what it means to you, what has happened in the past. We'll also come to Mr. Borishade. But first, I'd like to ask Professor Uja. I mean, the health sector is a sector that we've seen, we've talked about in recent times, time and again, especially with that strike. And I imagine that you're relieved to see that resident doctors are back at work. Just as a starter, I mean, to give us your opening comments, what is this to you? What exactly played out? Because I call the NMA giving a 21-day ultimatum. That elapsed, by the way, before this strike was called off. That's for Professor Uja. So first, can you let us know what went into the whole deliberations such that the resident doctors are now back at work? And what happened to that 21-day ultimatum that the NMA gave? Okay, I understand that we're yet to get Professor Oja, but let me go back to Mr. Borishade. Guess we'll just jump right into this Victims of Gunshot Act amendment. Just how big of a challenge was this, or is this? Because not everybody has been in the position of trying to get access to health care when they've been shot or when they've been injured and they're in a precarious situation. If you could just give us a background, because I know you've been involved with this. How much of a challenge is this?
Well, the issue of the treatment of gunshot victims remains a challenge. It has been a challenge and it remains a challenge. It remains a challenge because hospitals would not treat gunshot victims without police report. And that has created, problems such that even people who might not have been criminals might be neglected. So that remains a big challenge. Then came the Compulsory Treatment of Gunshot Victims Act, which provides that without any police report, any police clearance, without any monetary deposit, it is compulsory for hospitals to treat victims of gunshot. It is also compulsory for any citizen to render an assistance. And an offense under the Act, failure to treat a victim of gunshot and failure to render necessary assistance has now been criminalized under the Act. However, in my own opinion, the legislation remains a worthless piece of legislation to the extent that no funding is provided. How would you, for example, expect the private sector to obey a law that makes it compulsory for them to treat victims of gunshots. I mean, whether or not they pay a deposit. Even public hospitals are poorly funded. The series of strikes we have witnessed in the health sector by Johesu, by the NAD, the doctors organized under NAD, which strike has just been called off recently. All of this show the poor funding of the health sector. Therefore, without proper funding of the health sector, that legislation, in my opinion, remains a worthless piece of legislation. And I think that our legislators are merely begging the issue. The fundamental challenge is to bring that act. The fundamental challenge is to give effect to Section 17, 3D of the Constitution, which provides that government shall direct its policy towards providing adequate medical and health care for all persons, not just for Nigerians, but for all persons. For that to be given effect to, there will be a need, in my opinion, to criminalize medical tourism. Because unless and until it is criminalized to go abroad for medical treatment, our rulers will continue to neglect the medical sector. Therefore, our legislators should go beyond the scope of the act as it is today, which provides that you don't need to deposit money before you are treated. You don't need to have police clearance before hospitals attend to you. Where hospitals remain poorly funded.
Mr. Burchard, there are quite a number of issues. So quite a number of issues you have unpacked here. I mean, this conversation started from that compulsory treatment and care of gunshot victims 2017, the amendment, which is meant to ensure that they get care even without police report. But you have indeed taken this holistically, which is understandable. I mean, referencing the health sector, the decay and all that. And from what I hear from you, you are saying that this amendment, which has been commended largely, is not even enough to get us to start solving the problems of even gunshot victims to begin with. You think that perhaps another legislation should come up instead of this that treats the health sector in general, for example, criminalizes medical tourism, ensures that every Nigerian gets access to health? Is that what you're saying, that this is not the legislation we should be looking at? We should be looking at another legislation entirely? If yes, then which one?
Yes, we should be looking towards giving effect to the constitutional provision that provides that health care shall be given to all persons in Nigeria. We should note it. Section 17 3D does not even provide for adequate medical treatment or medical care for Nigerians. It is for all persons. Therefore, if that section of the Constitution is given effect to, you may not even need the act being discussed currently. But let us take it that gradually our rulers want to pay attention to the health needs of Nigerians. If they want to do that, I'm arguing that they cannot adequately do that without criminalizing medical tourism. It is because they have an opportunity to go abroad for medical tourism that they have allowed the health sector to collapse. Doctors were on strike for over 2 months. They were ignored. They would not have been ignored if they also do not have any discretion but to seek medical treatment for whatever ailment in the country.
So, Mr. Burchard, I just wonder...
Given effect to,
I just wonder what section of the Constitution will back that particular, consideration that you have proposed. But these are some of the issues we'll unpack when we return from this break. Don't forget, we still have Professor Uja joining us on this to give us the medical perspective. How has this lasted for this long? What kind of considerations do medical personnel put in place when they are treating gunshot wounds? And don't forget the big talk about the health sector in Nigeria at large. Stay with us. Compulsory treatment of gunshot victims and the health sector in Nigeria is still our focus on the program. Mr. Femi Borishade has been sharing his thoughts with us on the legal angle, the human rights angle. And just joining us as well is Professor Innocent Uja, who is the NMA president. Thank you for joining us as well. So let me bring this to you, because, I mean, the way the conversation has been going the past few days, in fact, ever since, reports of people that were killed as a result of not being attended to by health professionals who say we need to see a police report. Ever since that came out, there's always been that, finger pointed at health professionals saying, why would you do that? Aren't you meant to care for the victim first, save the life before you, ask for other questions? So what considerations really come into play for doctors, nurses, generally healthcare workers, when you're faced with a gunshot victim, for example? Is it default to ask for a police report, or what?
Well, thank you very much, Kelu. Before I start, I want to say that I'm the happiest person in this country at the moment, being that a Nigerian, Dr. Enabulele, have been elected as the president of World Medical Association. And it's a contestation of the fact that Nigeria is reckoned with internationally, and the Nigerian Medical Association has played its role in medical and healthcare worldwide. So I congratulate Dr. Enabulele, who is currently the president of Commonwealth Medical Association. Having said that, let's go to the substance of the case. The reality is that as doctors, we do not need anybody to give us any reports before, or police report, before we treat a patient. In an emergency situation, you don't ask for anything. You don't ask, all you do, in fact, even then, but particularly a patient that is unconscious, what you're interested is to ensure that you save the life of the person involved. Unfortunately, the law enforcement agencies in this country have lost their bearing in terms of control. They have no business asking us to make sure that we get police report before we treat emergency situations. Emergency situations are such that if you don't intervene, the patient will die. And by our training, we are to treat anybody, irrespective of tribe, race, political leaning, gender, and the rest, without asking for any police report. However, the Nigerian police should be educated on the role of the medical doctor. A medical doctor does not require anybody to give any permission before he attends to emergencies. We don't even ask for fees. You must treat, first of all, get the patient alive and before you think about fees. So by and large, the Nigerian Medical Association clearly knows that nobody should seek for permission from any police person before he treats any case of emergency, be it gunshot, be it severe cholera, whatever it is, whatever is brought to a doctor. He does not require to have a police report before he or she treats emergency circumstances, emergency situations, because emergency situation calls for emergency action. Otherwise, the patient will die, and that is not our training. We have to keep our patients alive and well, and therefore, it is not appropriate. In fact, when they talk about law, I feel very uncomfortable because there is no law that prevents a medical doctor from treating anybody at all. There's no law that I know. That if a patient comes, you must seek either a legal opinion or a police report before you treat such patients. That runs counter to our Hippocratic oath. So by and large, I'm saying that a doctor does not require a police report before he or she treats. But the reality on ground is that when you do that, you might be an accomplice. They might say that you are even a hobnobbing or a hiding or in complicity with a gunshot, particularly in cases of armed robbery, kidnapping, and the rest. So that creates fear, that creates uncertainty, that creates insecurity for the doctor. And probably that is the reason why some doctors ask for a police report. But by and large, there is no law that says that a doctor must seek for a police report before he or she treats an emergency.
Okay, now perhaps there is then a need for us to have a kind of background as to why it became necessary for doctors or hospitals to ask for a police report before treating anyone in the first place. Otherwise, you are saying essentially there is no basis for the law that is being reviewed to have been enacted in the first place in 2017. So if you can give us an understanding that many people may not have as to what necessitated this. You have referenced it by saying that sometimes the police, kind of makes this compulsory. But then if there is a background to this that you can give people so that they understand, as to why is it that hospitals ask for police report even though there is a law that empowers them?
Well, again, the truth of the matter is that asking for police report is totally unnecessary. I have said that before. Because there's no law that prevents a doctor from seeing a patient, whether in emergency circumstance or even in routine circumstances. However, I think probably is over zealousness of the police that when you treat such cases, they might say that you are in complicity, particularly in cases of gunshot wounds, of armed robbers and the rest. So obviously the doctor is not safe, and the doctor needs to be protected. And he or she needs to protect himself. I think that's the genesis. Otherwise, as a student of medical student, which I've been, I was a medical student over 40 years ago, and there was nothing about law treating. In fact, as soon as a patient comes in, you start treating. In emergency situations, you may not even need to ask for the name of the patient. You start treating, just get over the emergency situation, and then you begin to ask details of who the patient is, where the addresses are, what are the circumstances of the injury that he or she has sustained. But doing that in Nigeria is a big problem, because the police will come in and say you are in complicity with the armed robbers. You are treating a patient. You don't know whether it's an armed robber, because you don't have evidence that even if it's an armed robber, I can tell you that even if it's an armed robber, a doctor is compelled to treat to save the life before the police will take over the case. Okay. So I don't know the origin of that, but the reality is that doctors have been harassed. Doctors have been, some of them have been killed in the process of saving lives, because the police will insist that if you don't, or in fact, some of them are locked up, saying that they are even armed robbers themselves. And that again shows that we must sanitize our security system, because the doctor has no boundary as to who to treat in any circumstance. I do not know. As a doctor, as a medical student, there was no aspect of our training.
Just 1 second, Prof. This begs just one question who then should enforce that law. I asked because in most cases, whenever there is any wound, any emergency, people just take the wounded person around them to the hospital, whether there is a policeman there or not. So if the person, it just so happens that they take this gunshot wounded person to a hospital, and who then should enforce the law? The policeman is not there. And most cases, we've had situations, of course, that's in general, public sphere, where the hospitals will say, without a police report, we will not treat this fellow, even though there is no policeman there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We don't need a policeman to treat
No,
any
but
patient.
the question then is, who then should enforce the law? Who should enforce that law if the policeman is not there?
Which law?
The 2017 law that has been amended.
What I'm saying is that it's just a waste of exercise. You see, there should be no law to begin with to prevent a doctor from seeing a patient. This is the truth. What we are doing in fact, it violates fundamental human rights. Apart from the fact that the doctor has the right to treat anybody, whether it's an armed robber or it's a thief or whatever, even if it's an enemy. Look, if you get through a Hippocratic oath, you must treat every patient that comes to you. So the issue of waiting for a police does not arise. But I have also said that doctors have suffered enormously, in a circumstance where they treat these patients, particularly when it's an armed robber or a thief, and you do not know who a thief is. What you know is that a patient is brought before you, and you are obligated to treat such a patient. Okay, and if you have to treat such a patient,
Professor Oja, two things, a couple of things come up here. Pardon me to jump in. First is there a role for medical and dental council when such patients go before the hospitals and they are not treated? Is there a role for them?
Yes, of course. Such a patient should make a report to medical and dental council. If it's genuinely denied treatment, he should make his case before the medical and dental council. Secondly, and such a doctor will be brought before the medical and dental council through IP, and then, of course, the disciplinary tribunal.
In addition to that, I mean, you've talked about how doctors ought not to, because they make those calls that are non-medical calls. They should stick to the medical calls, which is within their purview and professional competence. Now, they also spoke about the Senate now. You should treat a patient and not ask them to deposit any amount or certain amount of money before they even have a look at you. That's what is being talked about now. But these days, you get to hospital to tell you, no, you have to go and deposit a certain amount of money first before we even consider you, whether you are at the point of death or not. Those are the accounts that we have had severally and still keep having. What is the position on that for the enemy?
Well, Chamberlain, the National Health Act provides 5% of the 1% of funds, the fund allocated for emergencies. But the question you and I will ask is that how much of that fund has been deployed? A situation where doctors in a hospital, as you all know, most of the clinical services are out-of-pocket expenses. We've talked about compulsory national health insurance scheme. These are some of the things that will be there that should protect the patients. And we are working towards universal health coverage, where lack of money should not be a factor for treatment. But in reality, is that the National Health Act has not been fully implemented. The 5% of the 1% fund that is allocated for treatment of our primary health care treatment and the rest, they have not been released for use. So obviously, the doctor in a private practice has to survive. The doctor in private practice needs to buy consumables. The doctor in private practice needs to pay the workers. However, in circumstances that the patient is in their need of treatment, I would want to plead with our colleagues to treat such patients. And unfortunately, when doctors do that and they say, well, if you don't pay, you cannot be discharged. They say the doctors are imprisoning the patients. So it is neither here or there. It's a very difficult situation in Nigeria. What we can do to overcome some of this is the National Health Insurance Scheme. If we have the fact that we have compulsory National Health Insurance Scheme for all adult Nigerians, you find that many of these problems will be sorted out because insurance will take care of it. That's what happens in developed countries, in places where health system operates. We are talking about challenges of healthcare financing in this country.
Absolutely.
It's a very serious problem.
Well, Prof,
and
when you talked about pleading, with your colleagues and the rest, I recall during the strike, successive strikes, people pled and said, we're pleading please shelve the strike. Well, I mean, pleading, they'll tell you, doesn't put food on our table. We need this money. And you have referenced that they need to buy consumables, they need to pay workers and the rest, which is why it's important to have perhaps some funds set aside, which I believe this amendment is meant to tackle. But let's take this back to Mr. Borishade regarding, where this came from in the first place. I recall, I think it was Senator Oluremi Tinubu speaking on the floor saying that perhaps it's a misinterpretation of the Robbery and Firearms Special Provision Act. And in Section 4 says that a person convicted of an offense under subsections 1 and 3, which was earlier stated of this section, shall be liable in the case of a hospital or a clinic, that's the B part, to a fine, and it goes on and on, or the hospital or clinic shall be closed down. So perhaps that's where this came from, but it clearly says that a person convicted of an offense. Do you think this is enough reason for hospitals or clinics to keep asking for this police report?
Well, as the Prof has pointed out, and as you have also read out clearly, there is no law that provides for the police report. However, I think that the legislators are trying to react to the reality of our experiences in which police reports are being required. And the doctors, the hospitals are trying to save their skin because they are required, if they treat any gunshot victim, to report to the police. And they are afraid if they should go ahead to report to the police, as Prof has pointed out, they may be regarded as an accomplice. So, in order to save their own skin, therefore, they seek to ask the victim or the families of the victims to provide police report before they begin treatment. Under the act you read out, the Robbery and Firearms Provision Act that you read out, they are required. Doctors or hospitals who treat gunshot victims are required to report immediately to the police. So I think the law was trying to react to the reality of our existence in terms of the harassment they may have or they have been facing from.
Yeah, sorry, I think this also puts the police in bad light. I mean, it sounds as though the police wants victims of gunshot wounds who are indeed criminals to die without getting health care, because if the law says if they're armed robbers or what, they need to even still present, I mean, it puts the police in bad light, and it would be good to get the police to actually clear this out as well, because clearly it's a big challenge. But from what we have seen so far, so there's asking of police reports, there's asking of deposit, financial deposit before a person is treated. There should be a deposit, and that's the financial angle. But a third one, which I'd like you to touch on, is people that help gunshot victims or accident victims, that help them to the hospital. There's always hesitancy now on the part of people thinking, well, if I help, I don't know what might happen eventually. Perhaps the case might turn around and the person might be termed an accomplice as well. That is something I've seen time and again. Is there any provision as well in law, since we're making it bare, that covers that or that protects them? Because they always say, be your brother's keeper, be the help, the good Samaritan. But people clearly are withdrawing these days because of their experiences. So what protects them under the law?
Yes, the Compulsory Treatment and Care for Victims of Gunshot Act has actually protected citizens who help victims. They are protected against any embarrassing or undue questioning by the police. So they are protected. And the challenge that we face, therefore, is to create awareness of the provisions of this act, though I argue it is grossly inadequate, but there is no awareness on the part of hospitals, on the part of citizens about the protection under the act. has protected people who provide help. And in fact, it criminalizes refusal to help. So it's important we create that awareness so that doctors, hospitals would no longer, be under any illusion that they need police report before they commence treatment. The critical issue is in terms of deposit. The Act also provides that you don't need to make any monetary deposit. You are entitled to be treated. But that is worthless in the context in which the public health sector is poorly funded, as we have seen with the series of strikes by NAD and Johesu and other health workers. It is poorly funded. Not to talk of private hospitals.
If I could just ask you this, well, yes, we get the point you're making.
Will be prepared.
If I could just put this in, yeah, we get the point you're making about funding the healthcare sector, because if those funds are not there, then the hospitals should just leave them, they might just be strangulated. But doesn't this, how do we then ensure that those patients who can pay are not lumped up or painted with the same brush? Because when you come up with emergencies and they tell you, well, go and do all that payment before we attend to you, people can, for those who can clearly pay, they say, look, you're just eating up a valuable time within which you can save this patient. And in some of those cases, the patients end up dying while they could still have paid if they had attended to them early.
Well, I think that the question of making deposit compulsory will be on the basis of the assessment by the hospital or the doctor of the victim to be treated. If a well-known person like you, approaches, I do not pray you are in that situation. The hospital, any doctor in Nigeria will know that no, Chamberlain can pay.
Whoa, don't give them ideas now, Mr. Borishaye. Let's go easy.
So I think it's on the basis of the assessment by the hospitals or the doctor or the victim they are confronting. But the Act, the Compulsory Treatment and Care for Gunshot Victims Act, already provides that you do not need to make any monetary deposit. It is compulsory for you to be treated. But the question is, where government is failing to provide the fund, that legislation will remain a worthless piece of paper.
And that's the key point, and I think Professor Oja has also made that point, because whether we like it or not, you need funds to actually even take care of the victims in the first place. So imagine there's nothing to take care of the victims with, and you're taking them in. How do you go about that? So as we wind down, Professor Oja, on a final note, two things that were raised earlier on, which you didn't quite get to respond to, and I'd like you to round off with that. First, on medical tourism, Mr. Borishaye believes that there should be a law, some sort of legislation to stop medical tourism, such that we can focus on our health sector locally and build it. Do you think there should be some sort of criminalization of medical tourism, first off? Professor Oja, that's for you. If you can unmute, please. Yes, you were asking to unmute.
Yeah, yes.
Oh, please go
yes.
ahead then.
Okay. What you are saying is not new to Nigerian Medical Association. Nigerian Medical Association has been actually advocating the issue of Nigerians to avoid medical tourism. We have said that several times. And how do you do that? And we even at the moment advocating for a health bank so that we can have functioning facilities like Apollo in India and ports in India. We have said this severally and several times that it's not for lack of knowledge, experience and skills that people are going to Europe and America and India. It is because the basic facilities for this treatment, for the treatment or care of our people is not made available. And once we are able to strengthen our healthcare system, going abroad will become, a thing of the past. However, fundamentally, anybody has a right to go to anywhere to seek for help, for healthcare, but not at the expense of government fund. Right. He can go with his private fund, but not at the expense of government fund. So
for you, in summary, okay, please round off. Thank you.
Yes, in summary, I'm saying that we must strengthen our own health system. We should establish health bank. If we can have bank of industry and bank of agriculture, why can we not have bank for health? Because that will strengthen. And of course, we need to, in fact, improve and ensure that we have a compulsory health insurance scheme for healthcare financing.
Right.
And of course, other sources of funding. We will
So
do
for
that,
Professor Uja,
establish state-of-the-art facilities where Nigerians can be treated, just like in Apollo in India and Forts in India too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. For Professor Uja, a blood bank is not enough. We need to have a bank for health as well. Would like to thank you so much, Professor Innocent Uja.
No, I talked of bank for health. I said
yes,
bank
that's why I said the blood bank is
bank.
not enough. We need a bank for health
No,
as
no,
well.
you're right. I agree with you. I agree with you. And I'm very happy today because a Nigerian is a president of World Medical Association.
Okay.
And this is a greatest achievement under my leadership.
Well, great place to anchor, Prof. President of the Nigerian Medical Association, Professor Innocent Uja, has been speaking with us, as well as Mr. Femi Aborishade, founding member of NCP and human rights lawyer. Thank you so much for your thoughts on the show this morning, gentlemen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, yeah, Prof had to make that point. Against leadership.
Yes.
That's human nature. People just want validation. So
Well,
it's okay.
It's
all right.
It was appropriated for.
Yeah, well done, well done. As long as Nigerians doing well, wherever they are, we always love it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, talking about the budget, we've got Professor Enaina, who is talking about the 2022 budget, and he thinks that until government at all levels, can we see that, guys? The first one. There you go. Says, until government at all levels diversify the economy, invest in agriculture and human capacity development, create an enabling environment for businesses to thrive, fix security, curtail corruption, will continue to borrow to fix the budget deficit.
We'll take a look at this one from Paul Agbolade, saying, I cannot imagine why people in charge of our economy keep borrowing to finance budgets instead of cutting down the cost of governance and reducing the budget size in line with the available resources. Really? A reasonable and future-oriented father will prefer to build a 3-bedroom bungalow family house using his personal fund instead of borrowing to build a duplex at the expense of the future of his wife and children. Let us maintain Nigeria at a break-even level, even if we believe that profit-making is not part of governance.
Adamu Sumaila says, the role of media, lecturers, health personnel, and junior military officers playing in Nigeria is an epitome. Beg your pardon. The role media, lecturers, health personnel, and junior military officers are playing in Nigeria is an epitome of commitments, yet they are neglected. The government and authorities concerned should motivate them by increasing their emolument.
Couldn't agree more. And then Adeni says that, still on the 2022 appropriation bill anyways, reasonable borrowings to finance public and infrastructure development are the key to faster economic growth, but excess borrowings without appropriate planning for investment may lead to heavy debt burden and interest payments, which in turn may create several undesirable effects for the economy. Mr. President is neither an economist nor a technocrat. He looks up to those he has tasked with the responsibility of helping to rejuvenate the economy to present and implement a good budget. But unfortunately, they're just messing up the whole thing. How in the world are we going to repay the 6 trillion naira that we intend to borrow?
Next one is on Gunshot Wound and Victims Care Act. I'll just run through this one quickly. And this act assumes that there is a medical emergency system supported by an integrated national ambulance service in the country, and also that Section 11, Sub 3E of the National Health Act, which dedicates 5%, and all of that are operational. Since 2014, when this law was enacted, it is yet to be operationalized sustainably. So he ends by saying the challenge is not to make new laws and formulate policies, but implementing them.
Well, Henry talks about the gunshot wound. He says that this act assumes that there is a medical emergency system supported by... Oh, that's one you took?
Oh, yeah.
All right, guys, that's it. So I just wanted to state that point. There you go, Mazel. So thank you all for watching. That is the show today. Wow, and for the week, actually.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time. I'm Chamberlain. So
I'm Kayode Okikiolu.
And I'm Ayo Makide. Have a wonderful day and please remain safe.